It is difficult to say exactly at what point fear begins, when the causes of that fear are not plainly before the eyes. Impressions gather on the surface of the mind, as ice gathers upon the surface of still water. Then a point is reached, and the mind realizes that something has happened. John, a young man of 26, was free from work, ready to skate and ski in the Alps to celebrate the new year. He occupied the top floor in one of those old, gaunt houses in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below was his own, vacant and unfurnished, and below that were other lodgers whom he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. He was catching the morning boat and planned to pack before getting a good night's sleep. As he filled his suitcase with clothes, the snaps broke off and fell to the floor. He had known it was deteriorating, but had expected it to last through one more trip. Now, he realized, he had made a terrible mistake. It was getting late, and he'd have to rush to make it to the store before it closed for the evening. Only a few blocks away from home was a secondhand shop. John entered, taking in the warmth, and was greeted by the shop assistant. He quickly asked for the largest suitcase in stock. The clerk took him to the back corner, where there was only one suitcase on display, well outside of John's price range. He asked if the price was firm, and the clerk only laughed. "I'll close in 5 minutes," he said. John panicked and looked around the shop, finding nothing in his price range that would do. "Please, sir, I'm leaving on a trip in the morning, and my suitcase just came apart moments ago. Any bag, do you have anything less expensive that I could purchase?" The clerk sighed deeply. "Please, there's nowhere else for me to go tonight, and I'd have to delay my trip." The clerk disappeared into the back. I could hear him shuffling around. I so hoped he'd find something I could afford. After a few moments, he came out with a large brown canvas duffel. He explained that it had only just come into the store, and, being quite dirty, he wished to clean it up before selling. But John didn't care at all about the stains or grime. He only saw the kit bag before him, easily large enough to hold everything he packed with room to bring souvenirs home. The clerk was willing to part with the bag at half the cost of the suitcase he displayed, and even took a bit off the price for its condition. John was thrilled. In just 30 hours, he'd be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. As he left the shop, he found the night to be cheerless. It was miserably cold, and few people were about. Sleety rain drove into the ground from above as ice-cold wind followed, howling dismally among the big, gloomy houses, and when he reached his home, he could still hear the whistling wind beyond his windows. He passed his landlady, shielding a candle from the draughts with her thin hand. "I'm going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks, if you don't mind collecting my letters." She winked at him. "And I hope you have a happy New Year, sir, and better weather than this." He shivered as he ascended the stairs. The sleet volleyed against the window panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee, and then set about packing. He liked the packing, as it brought the snow mountains so vividly before him. For the first time, he took a long look at his recent purchase. The bag was not elaborate in nature, a stout canvas kit bag, sack-shaped, with holes round the neck for a brass bar and padlock. Empty, it was shapeless and not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited, and he was thrilled that he wouldn't need to pack carefully. He shoved his coat, cap, gloves, and skates into the bag, followed by climbing boots, sweaters, snow boots, and earmuffs. On top of these, he added piles of woolen shirts and underwear, followed by thick socks. His suit was next, in case there was a fancy dinner at the hotel, and then he paused for a moment to reflect. It was after 10 o'clock, and a furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him up. He thought of the poor people he'd leave behind to spend their New Year in such a climate, whilst he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine, dancing with rosy-cheeked girls. That reminded him he must pack his dancing shoes and evening socks. He crossed the room to the cupboard when he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. He paused for a moment, listening. It was Mrs. Monk's, he thought. But then the steps ceased suddenly, and he heard no more. They must have been 2 flights down, he thought, and they belonged to a late lodger. John went back to his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts into the bag. By now, the duffel was 2/3 full and stood upright on its own, like a sack of flour. The clerk had mentioned it was dirty, but only now did John see how old and ratty it truly was. Faded and worn, obviously subjected to rather rough treatment. As he continued packing, John occasionally thought again about the footsteps down below. From time to time, he was almost certain he heard the soft tread of someone paddling over the floorboards, and they seemed to be getting nearer. For the first time in his life, John felt true creepiness. He had left the room for something, and as he returned, he noticed the top of the bag had lopped over, with the extraordinary resemblance of a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock filled the position for the eyes. A shadow, or possible stain, he couldn't tell exactly, looked like tangled hair. I shall be glad of a change of scenery, he thought to himself. In the sitting room, however, he was not pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize that it was much closer than before, as well as unmistakably real. This time, he got up and went to see who it could be at so late an hour. But the sound ceased. There was no one on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the vacant rooms. All empty. Only shadows. He called over the banisters to Mrs. Monk's, but there was no answer, and his voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house, and was lost in the roar of the gale that howled outside. Everyone was in bed and asleep. Everyone except himself, and the owner of the mysterious footsteps. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind after all, although it seemed so very real and close. He went back to his packing. It was getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up and lit another pipe, the last before turning in. It is difficult to say exactly at what point fear begins, when the causes of that fear are not plainly before the eyes. Impressions gather on the surface of the mind, film by film, as ice gathers upon the surface of still water, but often so lightly that they claim no definite recognition from the consciousness. Then a point is reached where the accumulated impressions become a definite emotion, and the mind realizes that something has happened. With something of a start, Johnson suddenly recognized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though he were doing something he knew to be wrong. It was a most disturbing and disagreeable feeling, not unlike the persistent promptings of conscience. Yet, though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. Pure nerves, I suppose, he said aloud with a forced laugh. Mountain air will cure all that, he added, still speaking to himself. And that reminds me, my snow glasses. As he passed quickly towards the sitting room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs. It was someone a few steps down from the top. They were in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters and the face peering up towards the landing. John had found the source of the footsteps. Who in the world could it be, and what did he want? John caught his breath sharply and stood still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs were empty. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated about the top of the staircase where he had seen the figure. Then he walked fast, almost ran into the light of the front room. As he passed inside the doorway, he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into his bedroom. It was a heavy footstep, but stealthy. The tread of somebody who did not wish to be seen. "That was someone on the stairs then," he muttered, his flesh crawling all over. "And whoever it was has now gone into my bedroom." His delicate, pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to think or do. Finally, he went into the other room, where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. "Mrs. Monks?" The words fell dead against the curtains in a room that held no other figure than his own. "Who's there?" he called again. "What do you want here?" The curtain swayed very slightly as he saw it. His heart felt as if it almost missed a beat. He dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window streaming with rain was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but clothes, and there was no one under the bed. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and as he did so, he nearly tripped over the large duffel bag. A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bathroom. He did not remember having moved it. It was very curious. Was he half dreaming? What in the world was the matter with everything? A terrific gust of wind tore at the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass. He came to his senses. "There's no one here, that's quite clear." Yet, even as he said it, he knew perfectly well he did not believe the words himself. He felt like someone was hiding close, watching him. He went back to the front room, poking the fire into a blaze, and sat down to think. Outwardly, John remained calm, pretending to the very last that everything he witnessed had a natural explanation, or was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But inwardly, in his very heart, he knew all along that someone had come up the stairs and gone into the bedroom. He simply needed to finish packing and get to bed, he told himself. This is all rubbish and nerves. But his face had lost all color. He began humming, a bit too loud to be natural, and crossed into his room when he felt every hair on his head stand up. The bag was right in front of him, several feet closer than before, and over the crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly shrinking down and out of sight. He was certain he heard breathing. Such a wave of terror came over him that he could do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back and legs, and he wanted so badly to scream aloud. "Who's there?" He had found his voice, though it was just a whisper. He stepped forward so that he could see all round and over the bag. Of course there was nothing there, nothing but faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, being only 3 parts full. And then he saw for the first time that round the inside Some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded blood stain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as if they had been burnt. At the same moment, the bag unmistakably lurched forward towards the door. John collapsed back, searching for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent his falling, and shut with a resounding bang. His left arm hit the light switch and the room went dark. He groped furiously for the knob to turn the light on again, but the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets. So it was several moments before he found the switch. And in those moments of terror, 2 things happened that sent him over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor, and close in front of his face sounded like heavy breathing of a human being. In his efforts to find the button on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers, and then he realized he dreaded the return of the light. It might be better for him to stay in the merciful screen of darkness. But he yielded to the original desire, and the room was flooded again with light. But the second instinct had been right. It would have been better to stay in the shelter of darkness, for there, right before him, bending over the half-packed bag, stood a tall, bulging figure, greasy and pale in the merciless glare of electric light. John felt a disturbing familiarity. Not 3 feet from him, the monster of a man stood, tangled black hair sprawling from his scalp. John attempted to grope the door handle, but the man lifted his devil's face and looked straight at him. "My bag." John finally clawed the door open and fell into a heap on the landing, knocking his head against the floorboards and going unconscious. It was still dark when he opened his eyes and realized that he was lying, stiff and bruised, on the cold boards. The memory of what he'd seen rushed back into his mind, and he nearly fainted again. Could it all have been a dream? He crawled to the front room as the wintry dawn began to peep at the windows, and covered himself with an overcoat in the armchair, and fell asleep for several hours. "What? You ain't been to bed, sir?" Mrs. Monks had come up the stairs, making a great clamor. Before he could answer, she continued. "There's an urgent gentleman here to see you, though it ain't 8 o'clock yet." Who is it?" "Says he's an officer," she replied. John wiped the sleep from his eyes. "Show him up at once, please." His head was whirling, and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. The officer apologized for the early visit and explained that an absurd mistake had been made. Somehow, he shared, the bag had disappeared from the courthouse, ending up at the shop John had patronized. The authorities had been working all night to track it down. But John didn't understand. For what reason would the bag have been in the courthouse in the first place? Yet, as he asked, he worried he may not prefer to know. "This bag was evidence in the investigation against David Turk," the officer said firmly. John went cold. In a flash, he realized what it all meant. The monster he had seen had been Turk himself, the wretched killer who'd so far evaded punishment for his crimes by claiming insanity. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how the papers told of Turk stuffing his victim's body into a kit bag for burial. The ghastly, dismembered fragments forced into this very canvas, and the bag itself produced as evidence. The shop owner was awful upset about it, sir, and asked us to deliver this one for you." The officer gestured to a large suitcase John had originally had his eye on. John couldn't find his voice. Finally, he said, "If you can unpack the bag for me, just empty the things onto the floor." He gestured to the bedroom, and the officer went inside for several minutes. He could hear the shifting and rattle of items being unpacked. Then he returned with the large empty bag folded over his arm. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Is there anything else I can do to assist?" John thanked him, still numb from the revelation and his unknown role in the middle of a murder case. "I'm glad you were able to track it down. If there's anything else I can help with," he continued. "I had really hoped to see Turk go away forever." The officer looked back with pained eyes. "It's almost like a part of me knew where the bag had come from. Last night, why, it must have been a nightmare, but it was so vivid. I swore I saw him here, like he'd come back for his property." A forced chuckle came from the officer, who hesitated before continuing in a low voice, as if he shouldn't say more. "Must have been a nightmare indeed," he said, "as it couldn't have been Turk. Bastard poisoned himself after release, about 10 o'clock last night." John's blood ran cold as his eyes landed on the old canvas bag. "Most disturbing," continued the officer, "was the note he left behind, written in blood. Said he deserved the same treatment as the woman he killed. Turk wanted to be buried in this same bag."